All right, good afternoon, good morning. Welcome everyone to Network 2020's discussion that we've entitled Farewell to Arms Control. My name is Courtney Doggart and I'm the president of Network 2020. For those who might be joining for the first time, we are an inclusive international nonprofit organization, and we're really focused on bridging the gap between the private sector and the international affairs communities. We're really striving to make important global affairs topics accessible and contextualized for audiences both in the United States and around the world. So thank you for taking your time to join us today and learn more. Today's conversation, I just want to say a few words about where we're at in the world. It's really happening against a backdrop of really horrific world events. And I think while we always knew of the fragility of that veneer of relative calm in the Middle East, I think to see events unfold with such ferocity and prioritization of political goals over human life is really hard to watch. And I think it should also be a reminder of why today's conversation is so important against that backdrop. Often the unthinkable is simply unthinkable until it is not, until there is a shift in the political dynamic or the manner in which policymakers evaluate consequences, or even the ability of interlocutors to communicate. And then the unthinkable becomes thinkable. And we now have at least two unthinkable situations that are thinkable: Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the really horrific attacks by Hamas and the terrible consequences that are now unfolding. Russia has nuclear weapons. Israel purportedly has nuclear weapons. And Hamas is backed by Iran, which is reportedly months away from having a nuclear weapon. So talking about the state of arms control is extremely relevant today. And I cannot imagine a better person to join us to discuss the state of arms control than Rose Gottemoeller. She is currently a lecturer at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and its Center for International Security and Cooperation. Before joining Stanford, she was the Deputy Secretary General of NATO from 2016 to 2019. Prior to NATO, she served for nearly 5 years as the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security at the U.S. Department of State, where she advised the Secretary of State on arms control, non-proliferation, and political military affairs. She was the chief U.S. negotiator of the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, New START, with Russia, and she also served as the director of the Carnegie Moscow Center from 2006 to 2008. So, as you can see, has a lot of very relevant experience in this realm. So welcome, Rose. It is really an honor to have you with us today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Courtney, and I'm very much looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you. Me too. Just to start us off, I always like to start with a scene setter. Could you, and I realize it's a very difficult thing to do, but could you just give us a brief scene setter in arms control? What are, in your mind, some of the key turning points of the last 2 decades that have brought us to this current point?
We have had a steady march of arms control progress, actually. I'll take us back 60 years to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. And at that time, I think the USSR, the Soviet Communist Politburo at the time, as well as the Washington leadership establishment, experienced a short, sharp shock. They realized how quickly we could descend into a nuclear conflagration. So despite everything that was going on at that time, the Vietnam War, battles in the Middle East in those days that were very significant as well, and other international crises, the United States and USSR began to work together to control and limit nuclear weapons and to negotiate the multilateral non-proliferation treaty. So that was a period of steady progress in the 60s and 70s. In the 80s, things slowed down again, but thanks to President Reagan and President Gorbachev of still the USSR, we were able to get back on track and negotiate the first intermediate range nuclear forces treaty, as well as the first strategic arms reduction treaty. And so there was, with fits and starts, I want to say it wasn't beautiful all along the way, but fits and starts, there was steady progress toward where I came into the picture, working as the chief negotiator for the New START treaty to replace the START 1 treaty, which went out of force in 2009 in December. So President Obama asked me to negotiate a follow-on treaty. And remember Dmitry Medvedev? He was briefly president of Russia from 2007 to 2011. And he and Obama actually got along pretty well. And the two of them agreed that we needed to quickly negotiate this follow-on to the START treaty, the first strategic arms reduction treaty. And that's how we managed in a very short time period, in 1 year, 2009 to 2010, to get this treaty finished. So it's been a mixed picture, but I would say generally steady progress up until the invasion of Crimea, first in 2014 and then in 2022, driven by Vladimir Putin, and all the problems that have flowed from that. So I do want to begin by saying, on a somewhat positive note, that we have made progress over the past 60 years.
Okay, that's good. And so at the current state we're in, we're New START, and I want to use the correct terminology here because it's not completely dead, correct? But it
Exactly
is
right.
no longer really being observed. Is that a safe assessment?
Well, we say that it's no longer being implemented in the way it should be implemented. The New START treaty limits US and Russian missiles and platforms like bombers and submarines deployed, we call them delivery vehicles, to 700, and deployed warheads to 1,550. So 700 missiles and bombers, 1,550 warheads. Those central limits of the treaty, despite the fact that Putin in February of this year pulled the plug on implementing the treaty as a whole, he said that Russia would continue to abide by the limits of the treaty for as long as the United States does. And our own president and his national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, have also said that we will abide by the limits of the treaty. So we are both continuing to limit each other in terms of the number of deployed nuclear weapons we can have. But at the same time, Russia pulled the plug on on-site inspection. They stopped exchanging data about their nuclear weapon systems. They stopped providing us daily notifications about how the weapon systems are moving around. For example, if an intercontinental ballistic missile has to go to a maintenance facility, they would notify us that it was leaving its silo, going to the maintenance facility, and then they would notify us when it came back again. So it was a good way that we had to check what we were seeing with our own satellites, what we call our national technical means, and really led to, I would say, very effective verification of the treaty. So now we've lost that. We have our own satellites, so we know pretty well what's going on. By the way, we have some great now commercial constellations of imagery satellites as well to back up the national systems. So we're not blind. We know what's going on with the Russians, but we have lost those important verification measures.
And when we lose those verification measures, what is really lost on both sides? I mean, there's the verification, but are there other pieces of the overall arms control system that is lost as well?
Well, nuclear arms control, as in any negotiated arms control, conventional or in other realms, we can talk today about cyber realms, for example, it's all about increasing mutual predictability so that we understand exactly what the Russians are doing with their nuclear forces, their strategic nuclear forces, and they understand what we're doing. And that predictability gives both sides confidence that we don't need to build up. We don't need to start a nuclear arms race. And so I do think that what we are losing is that predictability, and it's a dangerous moment because without that predictability and the mutual confidence that flows from it, we are in danger of spiraling into another nuclear arms race such as we had during the Cold War. And we don't want that to happen. It's not the best way to spend US national resources, our national treasure. And I wouldn't think the Russians would as well. But an additional factor, I know we'll talk more about it, but an additional factor is the Chinese and their own nuclear modernization, which has really picked up pace in the last couple of years. So that's an additional worry for the United States.
Thank you. And so when it comes to that predictability, drawing from your experience in Russia and working with Russians, Why do you think that Russia is choosing this loss of visibility or predictability at a time when, as you say, we're embarking on weapons modernization?
To me, it's really a strange phenomenon, Courtney, because to me, that kind of nuclear predictability, nuclear weapons are an existential threat. We could destroy each other, and we could destroy the globe if we ever exchange nuclear weapons. So it's really a major threat and existential to the human race. So I feel like no matter what else is going on in our relationship with Russia, and we're very, very concerned and condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine and have been assisting Ukraine throughout this war that Russia launched. So, from our perspective, we've got to continue to deal with the nukes. We've got to continue to deal with the existential threat, even though we are assisting Ukraine. And traditionally, there's been that kind of decoupling or delinking of these issues. I mentioned back during the Vietnam War, we were working on all of these new agreements. And, the Soviets were helping the North Vietnamese to shoot US pilots out of the sky. So it was a really tough period, but we still kept working to control nuclear weapons. Nowadays, Putin has said, no, you are assisting Ukraine. We therefore are going to link further nuclear arms control to your assistance to Ukraine. You back off from assisting Ukraine, and we'll start talking about nuclear weapons again. To me, this is not a reasonable nor responsible policy for a head of state that is a nuclear weapon state to have, but I can't get inside the brain of Vladimir Putin. I know he's fixated on Ukraine and achieving some kind of victory in Ukraine, so perhaps this kind of nuclear threat is attractive to him. Certainly some things he has said would imply that.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to shift gears for a moment and talk about a couple of terminology questions, because I just threw out the word modernization there. I'm way outside my lane. This is not my area of expertise. So I'd love to hear from you. What does weapons modernization really mean? And, within that space, is there a danger of misperception of what that actually entails when people hear the word modernization?
It does if people believe that modernization means a nuclear buildup and, again, spiraling into a nuclear arms race. But the important thing about the US nuclear modernization is, and President Obama was the one to launch it back in 2015, 2016 timeframe, and he underscored that this modernization would take place under the limits of an arms control treaty, the New START treaty. So the US was not building up and did not plan to build up its nuclear weapons or its nuclear missiles, its missile systems. What it was doing was replacing existing systems that are really very old and decrepit, to be honest with you. Now, the B-52 bombers have been deployed since the 1950s, and they still keep trucking those things. They are effective platforms, and have been upgraded, of course, a number of times since the 1950s. But for some of our systems, such as the so-called Ohio-class strategic strike submarines, there's a certain life for those hulls because they're down underneath the deep ocean, a lot of pressure on the hulls. They can only operate for so many years, and they are nearing the end of their service life. So the notion of the US nuclear modernization is to replace weapon systems that are aging out, and so we can maintain a safe, secure, and effective arsenal, as President Obama put it, for as long as nuclear weapons exist. But the idea is you continue to work on reducing and limiting nuclear weapons. He always emphasized the goal of getting to zero. He always said it's not going to happen within my lifetime, but we've got to keep walking down that road. And that has been the overarching philosophy in the United States.
Thank you. Another terminology, another phrase that we often hear that I think can use some clarification is this idea of strategic and non-strategic or tactical nuclear weapons. Could you please talk about what the difference is when it comes to arms control? Are tactical nuclear weapons still subject to treaties and in the implementation? So, as I like to put it, when we're talking about tactical nuclear weapons, should we be focusing more on the word tactical or more on the word nuclear, or does that even matter?
That's a great question, Courtney. And I like to stress that a warhead is a warhead is a warhead. I mean, there are bigger warheads, there are smaller warheads, but essentially the difference between tactical and strategic warheads is related to their delivery vehicles, is related to the range of the missiles that they are carried on. So strategic range missiles are missiles that are above 5,500 kilometers in range. In other words, the United States can strike Russian territory from our continental United States and vice versa. So that's what we think of strategic range systems, very long range systems. Systems that are tactical in nature or non-strategic is the more accurate term, are carried on missile systems and other delivery vehicles such as bombers that are below that range. And so they can be intermediate range, they can be shorter range, they can even, in some cases, we've referred to battlefield weapons. This was during the Cold War when both the United States and the USSR at the time were developing nuclear weapons as just any other kind of weapon. So in that era, we built thousands and thousands of warheads, and we were putting them on short range artillery and even nuclear mines on the battlefield. It's crazy when you think about it, because it would have been impossible to fight that war. And as President Reagan and Gorbachev said, such a war cannot be won and should never be fought. But that is the main difference. The strategic warheads are carried on strategic range delivery vehicles above 5,500 kilometers. And everything that's non-strategic, those are all the different kinds of missiles and delivery systems below 5,500 kilometers in range.
Thank you for that differentiation. I'd like to turn back now to the dynamic between Russia and the United States at this point, because you mentioned earlier that even during the depths of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union were still cooperating on arms control. And I think you've once very elegantly mentioned that during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union were together shouldering the responsibility, the burden of responsibility. So I have sort of a two-part question here. So one is, how does the United States shoulder that responsibility in the face of a country that seems no longer interested in jointly sharing that burden? Maybe that's a correct assessment, maybe it's not. And then the second is, just looking at the broader context of US-Russia relations, what role does trust play in the broader scheme of arms control negotiations, particularly when looking back on the past couple of decades between the United States and Russia, where that trust seems to have deteriorated. And I'd love if you could just pinpoint why that may be.
Well,
two big questions.
Yeah, those are two huge questions, but
Mm-hmm.
let me start with the second. Honestly, trust is built over time through the process of negotiation. I think when the Soviets and Americans first sat down after the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was actually very little trust on the two sides. But over the course of negotiations, when the other side is delivering on their promises, and that goes not only for the course of the treaty negotiation, but also then for the implementation, trust builds up. Sadly, there's been a history of Russian violations of major treaties. Again, it's under President Putin's watch, so he doesn't have, I guess, much regard for international law. I'll posit that idea. But there have been instances of Russian violations of treaties that have led the United States to withdraw from particular treaties. I mentioned earlier the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the so-called INF Treaty. And the Russians, they basically, it was a ban on all missiles between 500 and 5,500 kilometers in range. And the Russians basically built a new missile that fell into that range and then lied about it. So the United States did withdraw from that treaty in 2019. So there's been a kind of chipping away at trust over the years. Started at a low level, built up as we had some successes. Then this chipping away has happened. It's all part of the current trend in some ways, I think. But at the same time, I've always said We know how they're performing. We know if they're violating or cheating on a treaty. So if they are continuing to perform well and do their implementation job, then we should trust them. Ronald Reagan had this old line, trust but verify, which was always an important line during that administration. But I also say, all right, if you're verifying and you're getting results and you see that they're doing the right thing, then you trust. So it is a dynamic process, certainly, but I will say there's a certain human element to it too. If you're working with a negotiating team on the other side and you're working with other humans and you can see that they deliver on their promises in a negotiation, then that builds up trust. And that's part of that community that I was talking about of interest between Russia and the United States, where we were equally shouldering the burden because we had a history of working together and building up trust over time. And that's the great tragedy of this moment, to my mind. I've worked my whole life on these problems, and I've seen the ups and downs. But at this, I would say, well, late stage in my career anyway, to see suddenly that deficit of trust opening up again is a really terrible. Well, it's a terrible development from my point of view. But I do want to stress once again that you don't need trust to negotiate. You need a canny sense of your own self-interest, your own national interests, and you need to be able to defend those interests at the negotiating table. That's all there is to it. You don't need to trust to start a negotiation. Hostage negotiators know that. They don't trust the people who are holding the hostages, but they have a sense of what their interest is, and that's to get the hostages back. Sadly, thinking about this problem today in the context of what is going on in the Middle East.
Thank you. And going back to the first part of my big question, which is how does the U.S. try to shoulder that responsibility? When you're looking at what the United States can do in the grand scheme of things, if it's hard to work with Russia at this moment, where
Absolutely.
do you see progress being made?
Absolutely. And here, I think the United States just has to keep pushing the rock uphill. It's the task of Sisyphus, but the United States just has to keep pushing the rock uphill. And that means keeping offers out there and on the table. Jake Sullivan, I've already referred to, the National Security Advisor, gave a very important speech to the Arms Control Association in June, where he said, we are ready to resume negotiating with the Russians without preconditions. And we have some ideas about how to proceed toward the next strategic arms limitation treaty or agreement. Let's get going. And so despite the fact that Putin pulled the plug on New START in February of this year, the administration has just put that message out there. We believe it's important and the responsibility of our two countries to continue working in any way we can. So that's one thing. The messaging has to be clear and it has to be out there in the public. But the second thing is, and this is always so important in negotiations, really the behind the scenes work is all important too. The quiet diplomacy, where you can repeat the messages you make publicly, but you can also try to make small steps to continue to reduce nuclear risks. And here there is a group called the P5 group. The P5 are the nuclear weapon states under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They're also the permanent members of the UN Security Council. So that's UK, France, China, Russia, and the United States. So there is a P5 group looking at nuclear risk reduction, looking at strategic stability and how we might get back to talking about this topic and our nuclear doctrines. These, are quiet technical talks and they're behind the scenes. But I think they are important at this time when we don't have anything going on really between Washington and Moscow to keep up that quiet behind the scenes technical discussion among the P5.
Thank you. The United States and Russia are not the only nuclear armed states. You also mentioned China earlier, a country that officials are concerned about. Can you please talk about how you see China's nuclear weapons program developing and what kinds of negotiated limitations you can see being put on it?
Yes, China has always had historically a small nuclear arsenal. I mentioned that the United States and Russia currently have 1,550 warheads on deployed missile systems. But We have a total of approximately 4,000 to 5,000 nuclear weapons, of which 1,550 are deployed and the rest are held in storage facilities, central storage facilities. The Chinese have a total nowadays of about 500 warheads. So they have traditionally had a much smaller force. What we are worried about today is what we see as a rapid buildup of Chinese warheads. The Defense Department, US Defense Department, has estimated that by 2035, the Chinese will have 1,500 warheads. That's still less than the totals that we in China will have, but that's a rapid buildup. And I think the concern is that the Chinese could easily go higher if they wanted to. Furthermore, they're building more silos for intercontinental ballistic missiles. They've built 300 of them in the last couple of years, and so we're all scratching our heads. What are these silos for? If the Chinese are saying, oh, we just keep our forces small. It's for deterrence. It's to ensure if we take a first strike from another country that we can retaliate. So that's called assured retaliation, and that too has a nuclear deterrence function. But it means, in the case of the Chinese, they've always kept their numbers low, but we fear today that they are coming up to our numbers. And then the United States as well. That's a problem for us. We are facing not only Russia, but also China with significant numbers of nuclear weapons. So that's the big fear now, that somehow the United States will face two nuclear peers in the next decade. And that's what a lot of people are worried about.
And would you mind just letting us know what the situation is in terms of the potential for China to negotiate any treaties? Or, I mean, I guess maybe they're still too below threshold, but is there a point at which they cross where, or preemptively, diplomats and policymakers are going to say, hey, we really feel like we need some safeguards in place?
Well, the United States has already been saying that, and indeed the previous administration, President Trump's administration, tried to pull the Chinese to the negotiating table and say, you must join New START. Well, I didn't think that was the right approach, again, because you point to the fact that there's this great inequality. The US and Russia have pretty much equal numbers of warheads and delivery vehicles. So that is the main thing that brings a country to the negotiating table, when they have some equality of numbers and they can see a value in keeping the other guy limited. So equality of numbers, if the other guy can suddenly build up, you want to control and constrain that. That's the kind of equal reasoning for US and Russia to be in this process. So I think with the Chinese, it's good to try to draw them into a broader discussion, like in a strategic stability context, of what are their aims, what are their goals, and try to understand what they are trying to achieve by this buildup. And then I hope that we will be able to engage them also down the road in a negotiation. I think, frankly, the first negotiation should be on intermediate range missiles, to try to restore some of those limits on intermediate range nuclear ground launch missiles that I talked about going away when the INF treaty went away. If we could get back to a moratorium on such weapons with Russia and negotiate a new one with China, that would be a real step in the right direction, because China does have a lot of intermediate range ground launched missile systems, and they use them, or they don't use them, thank heavens, but they depend on them as a way to threaten US forces in Asia, including our naval forces. So I think, to have some negotiation with them where they see an equality of capability and they're worried about the United States deploying such missiles in Asia, that could be a reason that they would have an interest in coming to the negotiating table.
And to your knowledge, are there areas, just given the fraught relationship between the United States and China today, are there areas or places where those conversations about strategic stability are happening, whether it's at the government level or on the track 2 level? Are you aware? Are those conversations happening?
Yes, for your listeners, I'll just say track 2 discussions are discussions among experts, and experts who have some links into their governments. And so the answer to that question is definitely yes. There are a lot of track 2 discussions going on across both US China, US Russia, sometimes in a trilateral setting, So I think that's a good thing that there are many vigorous expert discussions going on across the world. But it's not bringing government officials together. I participate myself in a number of track two discussions, and of course, I always keep my former colleagues in government informed of the outcome. But you don't have a real government to government discussion in that case. So I've been glad, as I said, to see these P5 talks continuing to go forward, including a good meeting in New York at the United Nations a week ago or 10 days ago. So that's a good thing. But the next question is then, when can we actually get down to business? The current administration, the Biden administration, has really been talking to the Chinese about establishing a couple of working groups to work on economic and trade issues. I've also understood just from reading the press that they're working on getting a working group on these nuclear issues, nuclear nonproliferation and strategic stability going. So I hope that's the case. I think it's a good sign that Beijing and Washington seem to be talking together about getting a working group established. So let's see what will happen out of that.
Great. I have one final question before I'm turning to the Q&A box. So for those of you listening, if you would like to ask a question, please feel free to put it in the Q&A box, and I will get to as many of them as I can. So my final question. We titled this briefing A Farewell to Arms Control, hearkening to Ernest Hemingway's World War I era novel that is arguably about hope, or perhaps hopelessness without despair. So in that vein, when looking at the arms control landscape, are you hopeful? Are you despairing? What's your take?
This gives me an opportunity to bring up a very interesting vignette. Historically, of course, A Farewell to Arms, that title was ambiguous. The way Hemingway chose it, it was farewell to the armaments and the battles of World War I, or farewell to his love, and the way their relationship was portrayed during the novel. In Russian, it was always translated as Prashai Orужие, meaning farewell to armaments. Farewell to armaments, not that other aspect of a mutual relationship that, well, unfortunately, comes to naught in the book. But I do say that, and this is my answer to your question, Courtney, that it is an ambiguous moment in my view. And so I'm going to take the first translation. I'm not talking about romance here, but I'm just talking about the ambiguity of the moment, where I think we have an opportunity to continue to move forward, and we must make every effort to do so, both, as I said, with this public messaging that's going on, but also with as many private, quiet conversations as we have, whether it's government to government or in track two expert talks. But I think at the same time, we have to be feeling, well, pessimistic, just because of the overarching situation, the fact that the war in Ukraine continues to rage on. The United States and its NATO allies will continue to assist Ukraine in every way it can, and our Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, just made that point again in the last 24 hours. So I would hate to see progress on nuclear disarmament basically stop and reverse and perhaps head toward a nuclear arms race because of this larger and very dire circumstance with the war in Ukraine. But I think we have to be somber about it and recognize that that could be the future. So I say today, we have to get ready for a future that either could include more arms control, more nuclear disarmament, or could move in the opposite direction. And I think the United States needs to be ready for that. But I will continue to do everything I can to push in the direction of a more positive future.
Thank you for that. With that, turning to the Q&A box, we have one question here that asks, what was the reason that the United States exited the ABM, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, and the INF Treaty? And did that not hurt the arms control process? Does the United States not bear a shared responsibility for the arms control treaties falling apart?
In the case of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, and some of the listeners may not know, this was a treaty that was also negotiated during that really productive time in the 1960s and 70s. It entered into force in 1972, and it constrained strategic ballistic missile defenses. This may seem counterintuitive, but the notion is if you have a stable balance of nuclear deterrence, if you have, they have 1,000 weapons, just say, and we have 1,000 weapons on missiles, and if we are in a stable relationship from that perspective, if suddenly the United States built up a lot of ability to defend against Russian missiles, then they would be in a weakened position. They could not, the United States might be tempted, for example, to launch a first strike against the USSR. This would never happen, but this is all, this is this great theory of nuclear deterrence that's out there. So the idea was if you limit missile defenses, you can maintain a stable balance of nuclear weapons deterrence in that way. And so the ABM treaty was meant to do that. The United States, there were certain skeptics. So I'm going to buy that part of the questioner's question. The United States has certain skeptics of limiting our capability to do things in the weapons sphere, no matter nuclear or conventional. So they, in the end of the day, decided that that it was time to withdraw from the treaty so that we would be unconstrained in building missile defenses. But at the same time, and I want to stress this point because this is all a very confusing area of policy, but the United States, as a matter of national policy, has decided that it is first too expensive and second technologically too challenging to try to build a perfect missile defense against Russian missiles. And so the US missile defenses are directed at North Korea and protecting against a more limited threat from North Korea. But yes, you're right, it was the United States who withdrew from the ABM treaty to enable some modernization of our missile defense interceptors to go on. In the case of the INF treaty, here I place the blame really squarely at Russia's door because they did build this new missile and began to deploy it. The missile is called the 9M729, and they began to deploy it in Europe, in the European part of Russia, that allowed them to bring into range every single NATO capital, from the capitals in the north in Oslo all the way down to Madrid and Lisbon in the south. So this was a great worry for the NATO allies as a whole, and is one of the reasons that they were unanimous in confirming the Russian violation of the treaty.
Thank you for that explanation. We have a question here that's looking ahead. How do you see the coming increased use of AI relative to signaling errors that could lead to inappropriate use of nuclear weapons?
I think it's really a very large track of unknown territory. And I do fear and I'm concerned about the very issues that the questioner has brought up regarding nuclear signaling and deterrence behavior. Once you have machines that are essentially driving the pace of action, it can be very worrying at the conventional level as well as the nuclear level, because the escalatory pressure can come from the conventional level as well, not just the nuclear. So I've been very supportive of efforts that first the United States has undertaken to put in place the first normative principles to constrain the use of AI, for example, in command and control systems that are related to nuclear launch decision making, to say that we always must maintain top political leadership making the final decision, that it should always be the president, it should always be the top leader, perhaps with the support, always with the support of his military leadership, but sometimes, as in the case with Russia, they have also the military leadership in the decision-making loop. So I think it's vital that right now we begin to get the international community to agree to these normative principles. It's something that the United States has been working, I know, in the last 6 to 8 months with a draft declaration that they have tabled. I think that's very good. And there's also work on this going on within this P5 group that I talked about. I think if we can get the nuclear states to all sign up and say, yes, this is a principle by which we will abide. It's not something, of course, you can verify. You can't be assured of what the inner workings of the Russian command and control system are or is, but nevertheless, I think just to have that normative baseline in place will be very, very useful. And then we're going to have to go on from there. But there's a lot of unknown territory, and I worry again about the escalatory pressures that could come out of actions taken at the conventional level just for that signaling reason.
Yeah, that's a terrific point. We are getting a lot of questions about other countries and the role of other countries. So I'll give a couple at one time. So one is, do you see other countries that are significantly growing their nuclear arsenal? And then, going back to the P5, we have one question that asks, is the arms control issue or discussion only exclusive to countries with nuclear weapons, such as the P5, or is there room, or should there be room for countries without nuclear weapons to participate? And if so, what would be their role in the discussion table, and would it be as significant?
Okay, very good questions. First, I will say now that the big worry is the expansion of the North Korean nuclear capabilities. And again, their delivery vehicles, the missiles that they are building, are longer and longer range and more capable. So we used to worry in the United States that North Korea could range Los Angeles and Seattle and San Francisco, countries on the west coast of the United States. But as they've gotten longer range missiles now, we can see North Korea's approaching a time when they can hit targets all throughout the United States. So that's the reason why the United States has been really serious. They're still small numbers. They're such small numbers that the United States can hope to defend against them with ballistic missile interceptor systems, missile defense systems. So that's why we have this limited missile defense against North Korea. And I think it's really important now as they increase their capability and capacity. But they have relatively few warheads. I mentioned the US has 1,550 deployed. North Korean estimates vary, but 75 at most warheads total, and how many of those are deployed is a difficult question to answer. But if you're interested in these relative numbers, I would really endorse the Federation of American Scientists website. They have a very good breakdown in unclassified form of the relative numbers in and among the nuclear powers. But we're talking about 9 nuclear possessing states, including in South Asia, India, and Pakistan. By the way, Pakistan is another country that has been building up any number of different kinds of delivery vehicles, including some of those shorter range systems for so-called battlefield use, which I find, again, a mistake, because once you start using nuclear weapons on the battlefield, the uncertainty just of escalation spirals upwards, but you are also in territory where you are causing profound damage to the local environment that could extend to the global level as well. The P5 question. I will say, and here's a point that I think is important. I do believe that non-nuclear weapon states should and can contribute to the efforts by the nuclear weapon states. There's been a very important initiative going on over the past decade to bring non-nuclear weapon states to the table to talk about how to monitor and verify basically reductions in nuclear warheads. It's called the Initiative for Nuclear Disarmament Verification, IPNDV. I always get it slightly wrong, but it's called the IPNDV if you want to Google it. And here is where non-nuclear weapon states have been working very well with nuclear states to understand the details, the technical difficulties of monitoring and verifying warhead limits. And it's been a very important effort. So I do think more of that should go on. I also wanted to mention, though, that it's a time when we should be looking at new conventional arms control arrangements, because the whole European security system has been thrown into an uproar by Russia's aggression against Ukraine. But already Russia had either withdrawn from various agreements or ceased to implement them. The Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty is a great example, and the Russians are formally withdrawing from it right now, but they ceased implementing it in 2008. So it's time, I think, now to think ahead about when we get to peace with Ukraine and Russia. We all hope for that. What are we going to do about the future of the European security system? So here's where non-nuclear weapon states, of course, will be front and center in the action in terms of figuring out what arms control measures can apply at the conventional level. And by the way, I see no reason why China and Russia shouldn't also be playing with this set of ideas in Asia. They already have bilateral kind of conventional confidence building measures going on. There should be a way, I think, to engage countries in Asia on this set of questions as well.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions about Iran. So one questioner asks, what will the United States do if they believe that Iran has or is about to get a nuclear weapon when the treaty, I think they're referring to the JCPOA, doesn't work? And then we have one that is asking, let me see if I can find it. Where did it go? There was a question, how likely is a nuclear-armed Iran, and will Israel, with or without the United States, act preemptively to prevent such an eventuality?
These are really tough questions, very good questions, but really tough questions. I think the United States will do everything it can to slow and try to halt any kind of nuclearization process, weaponization process in Iran. Clearly, the Iranians have now built up their capacity and capability to enrich nuclear material that could be used in nuclear weapons. As far as I know, they still have not proceeded to weaponization. But it's a difficult moment for any kind of effort at diplomacy because we are all very concerned that Iran has been driving the action with Hamas in Israel. They also, of course, are the supporters for Hezbollah in Lebanon. And we don't know yet where this conflict is headed, but it's a difficult moment for the United States to try to engage on the nuclear questions. But my own view is the United States should continue with partners, with others, to do everything they can to prevent that step of Iran weaponizing its fissile materials. So it's not a good, I would say, straightforward and easy answer, but it's, I think, something we also have to remain very alert to, and the United States should be continuing to message the Iranian leadership of the dire consequences. Iran is suffering, as we know, from the sanctions that have already been imposed against it, so it has to know that there will be costs if it proceeds in that direction. I'm sorry, the second question was?
The second question was about the how likely it is, which you've addressed, but will Israel, with or without the United States, act preemptively to prevent such an eventuality?
Yeah, I can't say. And I hate to speculate on hypotheticals, so I think I will just leave that one alone.
Okay, staying in the Middle East, because we're also getting a couple of questions about Saudi Arabia. So what is the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia? And what's the conversation about Saudi Arabia in terms of nuclear weapons?
Well, Saudi Arabia is a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-nuclear weapon state. So that's the baseline assumption of the United States, that they are a non-nuclear weapon state, and we work with them as a non-nuclear weapon state under the NPT. Now, Saudi Arabia has made no secret of its desire to acquire nuclear power, nuclear energy. And it is in that context, in this recent phase of negotiations, that the United States has been talking to the Saudis about so-called 1-2-3 agreement, which is the agreement under which the United States, they would accept certain obligations, the Saudis, and then the United States would be willing to work with them to help facilitate and, I would hope, sell American nuclear power reactors to Saudi Arabia, but under the aegis of certain safeguards that would be worked out in a 1-2-3 agreement. I've understood, again, just from press reports, not because I know anything directly about the negotiations, but press reports that the Saudis have been seeking the right to enrich nuclear material under the 1-2-3 agreement. In my opinion, this would be an outcome of the negotiations I would want to avoid. But now the negotiations have halted anyway because of the Hamas attacks on Israel and the ensuing military action in that part of the world. So I don't know when they're going to get back to the negotiating table, but I would certainly myself discourage the notion of Saudi Arabia acquiring fissile material enrichment capability.
Thank you. Switching gears a bit, how does NATO plan to address emerging security challenges in the absence of traditional arms control measures? And are there specific alternative approaches or strategies that NATO is considering to ensure strategic stability and prevent arms races?
One of the bywords at NATO at this period, and I think also in Washington, is the necessity of building resilience. That is resilience to whatever happens. If the Russians continue to build up their missile capabilities, even for threatening NATO with conventional attacks, not nuclear attacks, the NATO allies know that they need to build more resilient and capable integrated air and missile defense. So I think there will be a lot of emphasis in NATO going forward on building up resilient command and control, resilient missile defense, resilience in our, I still say we, although I'm not NATO DSG anymore, ability to have a resilient means to reinforce NATO forces in Europe from the United States and Canada. And these are all very challenging areas to work in. But I think that's one major way that the NATO allies will continue to respond to these new threats. They've also made some explicit, I would say, statements about if Russia, for example, continues to deploy this missile that is threatening at intermediate range all NATO capitals, the 9M729, then NATO will be looking at a decision to deploy conventionally armed intermediate range missiles of the United States in NATO countries. So it's a kind of idea that's on the table. It has not yet been effected. It hasn't been implemented, but I think there's an area where the NATO allies could join with the United States and negotiate with the Russians on reestablishing a moratorium on intermediate range missile deployments in Europe. And Putin himself put a pretty interesting proposal on the table back in October 2020 before all of this recent tragedy unfolded. So I do think there's possibilities there at the negotiating table, and I think NATO allies would like to see some of those possibilities bear fruit.
Thank you. This next questioner asks, could I ask Rose to comment on the linkage, if any, between bilateral arms control talks and Russia's recent steps to de-ratify the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and block the outcome document of the latest Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference?
Yes, I said publicly this weekend when the news was unfolding about de-ratifying the CTBT that Putin seems to be abandoning the last scrap of moral high ground on which Russia has been standing, and that was that they had fully ratified the CTBT and were waiting for the United States and also China to ratify the treaty, as well as certain other states, North Korea among them. So I think it's definitely a step in the wrong direction. From what I understand, listening to President Putin and listening to others in the Russian system, they are not talking about returning to testing, that they are talking about, Putin has been quite explicit saying only if the United States returns to nuclear testing will Russia return to nuclear testing. So I think that's a good message. I hope that there will be continuing also messages from Beijing directed at Moscow that they are really cutting all ties to a kind of cooperative world of trying to work together on these problems. And that's a bad thing for Russia as well as for all of us. But we'll see where we go from here. And I do think, again, it's important for the United States to keep offers on the table and keep messaging the importance of continuing to try to work on these issues. Jill Hruby, who's the administrator of the National Nuclear Security Administration in the Department of Energy, this is the organization that's responsible for US nuclear weapons. She spoke in Vienna at the CTBTO, this Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization, a couple of weeks ago, and put an offer on the table. Okay, if you're concerned about what's going on at the US national security site, we don't call it the Nevada nuclear test site anymore because it's not a test site anymore. It's a national security research area. She said, please come. We're offering a visit we'll show you what we're doing. We do nuclear experiments there to maintain the safety and effectiveness of the arsenal, but we're not exploding nuclear tests. And so come and see what we're doing. And that kind of, I would say, offer is very valuable in terms of showing that the United States wants to do the right thing.
Yes, great point. I'll try to get in a couple more questions. We have one here that says, what prospects are there for the introduction of a multi-stakeholder group that would be mandated by key actors to oversee and ensure delivery, validation, and transparency of agreed actions by arms control negotiation signatories?
I'm assuming this is in a multilateral context?
Yes, yeah, it
like
sounds
the
in the
question is
multilateral
about.
context. Yes, yeah.
Yes, well, we have some, I would say, some good experience in this regard. Again, working in a multilateral way to continue the implementation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The previous questioner made note of the fact that the Russians had not allowed the outcome document from the review conference of the Non-Proliferation Treaty last August to go through, and I agree. So Russia there again is abandoning these scraps of moral high ground, and I hope that that kind of behavior will turn around. But I think we do have a considerable degree of experience working together in the international community to resolve issues and move forward on implementation. Here again, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization is a great example. It has implemented over many years now the so-called international monitoring system with seismic and other kinds of monitors all over the world to monitor for illicit nuclear testing. And by the way, even though the CTBT has not entered into force, we have had a test moratorium in place for many, many years. In this century, since 2000, the only country who has tested has been North Korea. So everybody else has ceased nuclear testing. And the IMS and the CTBTO help to ensure that that moratorium is monitored. So, and their countries are working together all the time. The Chinese, the Russians, the United States, we're working on technical questions. So, and other countries who are not nuclear weapon states are working there all the time. So it's a very, very good effort. And I think it's a great example of exactly what the questioner is asking about.
Thank you. And just a couple final questions on the Middle East. What role does or will Russia and the United States play in non-proliferation in the Middle East, particularly in the context of recent events in Israel? So I'll leave it at that because I think that's probably enough for the rest of the session.
Well, my hope is that we can go back to working together. Listeners may not remember this, but just a few years during the Obama administration, we had a great negotiating team together to work with the Iranians and put in place the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA. So believe it or not, just a few years ago, in 2015, less than 10 years ago, we had China, Russia, the United States, the EU, and Iran all working together to put in place this agreement to get the Iranians to stop enriching fissile material, nuclear material that could be used in weapons. And to my mind, that was a huge tragedy when President Trump pulled the plug on the JCPOA, but I'm just talking about the negotiations now. It was this big international negotiating team, and China and Russia and the United States were all doing heavy lifting to work on parts of this problem. The Russians themselves provided certain compensation to the Iranians and took back some nuclear material from Iran. The Chinese helped to dismantle the heavy water reactor that would produce, again, a material needed for nuclear weapons development. So everybody was doing heavy lifting. Everybody was invested in this process. And of course, you look at it now and you say, no way, there's no way we can get back to that again. But I know we've done it less than 10 years ago. So I'm going to hold open the hope that someday we can get back there and begin to, again, do everything to restore. I think in the near term, we must do everything we can to restore peace in the Middle East, as well as in Ukraine. But at the same time, we've got to look to the future and have these ambitious goals to ensure that we do not end up with a highly proliferated nuclear world. That's not in anybody's interest.
And that memory of those negotiations are perhaps a hopeful note to end on, if we could, aspirational, if we could get back to that. So, Rose,
Exactly.
thank you so much. You're a wealth of information. And thank you, everyone who listened and asked great questions. I really appreciate that you're here and taking the time to learn about these things. Just as a quick note, our next briefings we have one for members only this Thursday evening on it's virtual on the Polish election, so that should be very interesting with Ambassador Daniel Fried, and then we have an in-person briefing in New York on the 25th on the global battle to regulate technology. So if you're not a member and interested in becoming a member, please reach out. My final plea is that we're a nonprofit and we're really trying to keep these conversations free and open to all around the world. So if you can donate, if you enjoyed this, please do. We really appreciate it. Rose, thank you so much. It was an honor, a real privilege.
Thank you, Courtney. Great conversation. Thank you to all the listeners. And I'm going to give a quick shout out to Dan Fried, who's fabulous. And if anybody knows about the Polish elections, it is he.
Absolutely. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.